Welcome. This is the inaugural Black Oregon POV podcast. I'm your host, Bruce Poinsett. I have a special guest with me today, founder of the Oregon Remembrance Project, Taylor Stewart. Taylor, how are you doing on this Tuesday?
Yep,
Yep,
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Really excited to be here with you, Bruce. Super excited about what you're working on and just grateful to be a part of it in this fashion.
Oh, awesome, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, it is May 19th. We're actually going to be joining you for Oregon Remembrance Project's initial sunshine trips. Just going to be whole thing down to Ashland, Oregon, Southern Oregon this weekend. So it's
Yeah,
very timely. But I'll also share that because yeah, it's we're heading into the 250th anniversary of America. I feel like I should put that in quotes, honestly, because people were here before then.
yes.
But as we were kind of just talking over email about this, you also mentioned just coming back from London and really being struck by how much the civil rights movement had an international effect, and how much it's like, how is that talked about, especially taking it to Oregon history and Oregon Black history, and like how much that gets left out of all these stories. So I really just want to start there. When you say like
Yeah,
you
perfect.
went to London and you were just struck
Yeah,
by it,
so
talk more about that.
you reached out to me at the perfect time. I went to London, and with the 250th anniversary coming up, that's been on the sort of back of my mind for a lot in 2026. So I went to London, for just personal pleasure. It was my wife's 30th birthday, so we were going for just fun, but my brain can't help turning on sort of the work brain. And so as I was walking around sort of their equivalent of Times Square, in the lead up to the trip, I thought I was going to be very cognizant of my status as an American, knowing all that was happening in the world and particularly our sort of current pariah state. But immediately, I noticed and realized that my status as an African American was much more salient than just my status as a U.S. national, and that was partly due to I didn't expect, but you could sort of just physically tell whether someone was a Black British individual or whether they were African American. Um, there was just sort of a difference in facial structure that in for Black British that were a little bit different than I just saw someone walking on the street and I was like, oh, I know you're an African American from the United States. And so I was just very cognizant of how I was walking through the city, and you could without needing to talk to me, just know that I am an African American from the United States. And so um, that had me thinking about, what? I don't really know anything about the history of racism in England. And so I did a little bit of research that first night, and I was curious. I was like, who was their sort of Martin Luther King equivalent figure? And they did not have a singular figure who met that mold exactly, as they had more of a collection of folks who led their civil rights movement. However, there was a man named Paul Stevenson who was the most ideologically similar to Martin Luther King, and he led a bus boycott in 1963. And England passed their first national civil rights legislation in 1965. And that stood out to me because he was inspired by the Montgomery bus boycott, which happened in 1955. And it struck me how there was only 2 years that happened in between their bus boycott and their national civil rights legislation, whereas there was 10 years that happened in between our bus boycott and our national civil rights legislation. And so my takeaway was like, man, we're really up against the hardest foe of racism as it exists in the United States, and how unique our story is internationally. There is no international counterpart for the wave of counter-revolutionary terror that swept the former Confederate States after emancipation. There is no international counterpart for lynching. There is no international counterpart for Jim Crow segregation. There is no international counterpart for mass incarceration. And so this story of the black advancement and the black quest for equality is really a unique story in world history. And people joke, and I joke myself, that my takeaway from going internationally was, what an exceptional story. So you're like, my takeaway was American exceptionalism. That like, wow, what an amazing story in terms of black people in the United States that I feel privileged to get to be a part of. And so, we went on this trip end of March, early April, and I was thinking about, that legacy is going to be mentioned, in part as part of the United States 250th anniversary. But us here in Oregon, we're going to largely get left out of this story about racial justice in the United States. And I think that that is a disservice to how we should understand racism in the United States, because though we did not have chattel slavery here in Oregon, the fact that this state was founded on racially exclusionary laws is something that should be known across the country. Here in 2026, it was illegal to be black in Oregon for nearly 40% of our state's history, which is a wild thing to think about. I have lived in Oregon for 30 years, and even after those 30 years, it was still nearly 40% of our state's history that it was illegal for me and you to be here. And so thinking about that really sort of I think it is really important for us in Oregon to, what I have been jokingly saying, start to bring some main character energy to how Black Oregonians should be thought of in terms of this wider landscape of racial justice in the United States. And so, with a lot of the communities that I work with, particularly in Southern Oregon, my first project was in Coos Bay, Oregon, where I worked with the community for 3 years to memorialize a man named Alonzo Tucker, Oregon's most widely documented African American victim of lynching. And so from that first project, this story of Alonzo Tucker and the work that we did in Coos Bay has really spawned other historical reconciliation projects around the state and really created a movement that I hope our state can be known for. And so what I tell people in Coos Bay, I was like, one day I want you to become known as the Montgomery of Oregon, the place where this movement started. And so I really hope that one day, when we get to the 300th anniversary of the United States, that Oregon can be a main character in the story for how we understand the advancement of racial justice in the United States. I hope that Coos Bay, Grants Pass, Ashland will be mentioned in the same paragraph as Selma, Montgomery, Alabama. And I think that we have a particularly unique story here in Oregon, just like the story of African Americans is unique in world history. And I think that our story really needs to be highlighted more. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to join with you in promoting the story of Black Oregonians, because I really do believe it is a story that should be known by Americans across the country.
Mm. That reminds me of having a conversation with a partner about, it's actually about an artist in Seattle, but it's a very similar dynamic to Portland because they're from the South, and they found it kind of almost kind of like novel or interesting in terms of this perspective of having to fight for just to be seen out here. It's like if you grow up in a community with, it's like you're surrounded by other black people, you know, we were talking with someone, not even a black person, but came from the DMV, and just saying like the idea of not having black representatives is
Mhm,
weird to them.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
And I feel like just growing up here, it's something I definitely kind of take for granted because it's like, yeah, this is the environment we live in.
Yeah.
But that same point of like, people should know this history. People should know what people are doing out here because when you talk about all these places, whether it's Grants Pass or Ashland or Bend or Astoria or Coos Bay, even Joseph, Oregon, Eugene, Salem, I even shout out my own hometown, even Lake Oswego, in spite of the dynamics that built this state and made it so there are so few black people in Oregon. Shout out to Walida and Marisha in the presentation. Why are there so few black people in Oregon? But we're here. We're
Mhm.
everywhere. And what it takes to make place, whether it be for yourself, for members of your community, in these spaces, in spite of all of that, that's a real story. That's real work that it gets swept under the rug. Even these stories of people who, we talk about the exclusion laws, and I think a lot of people, because we don't really dive into them in classes, you know, it's something you have to learn basically, like you have to seek it out.
Mhm.
So it sounds more like, oh, well, those were some laws on the books, but that didn't really happen to anyone, did it? And it's like, no, there's
Mhm.
the story, and we're talking before we hit the record button, we're talking about Jacob Vanderpool in Oregon, the fact that that's a story that people should know
Mhm.
everywhere. But
Yeah.
where do
And
you see it?
I will need to go to Washington, D.C. to confirm this, but I don't know, and right now, based on some initial research, I don't think that Jacob Vanderpool is mentioned in the National Museum of African American History, which is mind-blowing to me, and I feel like so perfectly illustrates how Oregon is sidestepped in terms of understanding racism in the United States. Like that should be one of the first facts you learn at the National Museum of African American History is that an African American was expelled forcibly from a state within this country simply for the crime of being black. And that not being a nationally known fact, I think, is a disservice to how people perceive Oregon within the larger landscape of the history of race in America.
Mhm. Yeah, expelled for being black and owning a business that, rivaled a white business. And it's just that
Hmm.
simple, which again, just same with, history of lynching laws,
Hmm.
expulsion laws, and tells you a lot, even to, again, if you want to understand redlining, you want to understand gentrification and displacement to this day, there's a through line there.
Hmm.
And that's important.
I also think it is a good illustration for the case for reparations apart from just chattel slavery, where we looked at, um, the competing white business and Jacob Vanderpool and him being expelled. Think about, in Oregon City, all of the street names, all of the buildings named after some early Oregon City settler. We could have had a Vanderpool Street, a Vanderpool Mansion in Oregon City contemporarily, and you think about what how Jacob Vanderpool could have built generations of wealth by being one of those early Oregon settlers. For me, that is one of the clearest examples for why we need some sort of reparations in the United States because the way that African Americans were excluded from institutions, opportunities, and wealth really is one of the driving factors for why we have this contemporary racial wealth gap.
Exactly. And something you named earlier in England, as far as how so much of this is framed without that central figure, and it's more of this collective thing. As a storyteller, I'm always curious about kind of how that happens. Is it a factor of just like one, just like American culture and like the way we do media, and also, just like the politics of it, where people get lifted up, but then also we know that there's plenty of people within the civil rights movement, and it was very much a collective effort. Although on the flip side, it does make me think about when we lift up Oregon history and like studying this, we know some of these more specific figures, but there's also kind of a similar like collective thing just because in part maybe because we haven't really like lifted anyone just
Mhm.
that high as well. But I'm not sure whether that's a good or a bad thing. But to your point, as far as like sharing these stories is so important because it just makes me think of work and even just trying to like get art projects depicting not just like, you know, theoretical or um what was it nondescript black people in a place like Lake Oswego, but actual history makers and
Mhm.
how much, for for those listening may not know some of the backstory. So I was part of a group respond to racism in Lake Oswego, and one of the projects we worked on was a mural for our founder, who happens to be my mother, Willie Poinsett, that now sits on City Hall in Lake Oswego. And that was a multi-year fight for something that is now, celebrated by most, although I'm sure there's plenty of people in the town who absolutely hate it. They're just know better than to get too loud about it. But as you know, like in working with on the Alonzo Tucker Memorial, and just I should actually back up again for like people who may not be familiar with the work of Oregon Remembrance Project, give you a little bit to just kind of talk about what you all
Yeah.
do.
So, I started the Oregon Remembrance Project in 2018 after a life-changing trip to the American South. And that's where I first learned about the legacy of lynching in America. And in particular, I was so struck that I had lived in Oregon my entire life. At this time, I was 22. That I had to go all the way to Montgomery, Alabama, just to learn that there had been at least one widely documented lynching of an African American here in Oregon. And so I worked with the community of Coos Bay for 3 years to memorialize Lonzo Tucker. February 2020, we held a soil collection near the spot of the lynching. In June 2021, we unveiled a historical marker in the community. I tell people that there are 2 days of significance on the Alonzo Tucker historical marker: 1902, when the lynching occurred, in 2021, when the historical marker was unveiled, and that we can't fully understand the story of Alonzo Tucker only focusing on the 1902 date, as his story now continues on into 2020 and 2021, when that same community where his lynching occurred used his memory as inspiration for becoming a community more committed to the ideals of truth, justice, and reconciliation. And so, what started originally as just this obscure personal side project eventually became how I hope to spend the rest of my life, helping other individuals and communities with similar truth and reconciliation projects in Oregon. And so, this work has expanded to cover Oregon's history of sundown towns, Black exclusionary laws, and KKK activity. Our signature program is called the Sunrise Project, where we help communities in Oregon that have a history of being a sundown town, communities that purposefully excluded African Americans and other racial minorities from living in or simply passing through the community through a culture of fear, violence, and intimidation. And so we help these communities develop these new identities as what we call sunrise communities, essentially the opposite to a sundown town, a place where everyone can feel safe, respected, and like they can call that space their home. And hopefully, in the coming years, hopefully in the next 2 to 3, we will be installing a historical marker in Grants Pass, Oregon, that covers Oregon and Grants Pass's history of racial exclusion, but also functions as that community's stated commitment to inclusivity or sunrise commitment. And what is exciting is that will become the United States' first ever historical marker about sundown towns. And the goal is to expand the Sunrise Project across Oregon and create a blueprint for communities across the country. And as you mentioned at the start, you will actually be joining us on the launch of our newest program called Sunshine Trips, where we will be bringing African Americans from the Portland area on free 2-night trips to some of ORP Southern Oregon communities. And so the genesis behind this trip is that we live in a beautiful state with rich history and culture, yet so much that beauty and richness feels inaccessible to communities of color and specifically African Americans. And so I have lived in Oregon my entire life, but for the vast majority of that, I only really had a strong sense of being a Portlander and not necessarily a strong sense of being an Oregonian. And it wasn't until these last few years where I've really been traveling the state doing the Oregon Remembrance Project that I developed my sense of being an Oregonian because I expanded my sense of home ownership and space within this state. And so I want to be able to share that same experience with other Black Portlanders, for people to feel like they get to call this place their home outside of the bounds of the Portland metropolitan area. Growing up, I don't know if, like me, you traveled the state very much. We really went to the coast and Bend, and that's it. And I really want to be able to open up the experience of travel for Black Portlanders to feel like they can claim space in Oregon outside of just the Portland metropolitan area.
Yeah, no, my family was definitely very similar. Like the only places we really went to the coast a little bit, but it was mostly related to like my parents' work trips.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, there's like if we went out east, I remember because there was like a was it like church leadership retreat in Idaho. So
Mm,
it's like, okay, we drive through Pendleton and Eastern Oregon for that. We go to like Salishan or, again, like this places on the coast for little things. But I didn't really have that perspective about the state until I got to work on the State of Black Oregon 2015
mm,
project.
mm,
And for that, it's like I got paired with, the great Intezar Abioto, and we were just traveling around the state doing case studies of Black life in different places. And that wasn't until I really, you know, on that drive out east for some interviews where I was like really like actually looking at the gorge and saying, wow. Or driving
mhm,
down to Central Oregon, especially, because there's certain spots where it's like you're like it almost feels like the cradle of civilization. You're like right down there next, just like to, oh, this, God, what was it? There's like a scene, the movie Lucy from years ago,
mhm.
but it just reminded me of just like that kind of like primordial scene and just like that nature. But
It's where this is such a beautiful state, but
Mhm.
like think about all the Black folks that you grew up with. Like, no one ever said like, "Hey, what'd you do over the summer?" Oh, we like traveled to the gorge. We went to, I don't know, Black people who go to Crater Lake. Like, it's literally one of the greatest natural wonders of our state, but like we just don't go because we're like, yeah, that'd be great to go to Crater Lake, but I don't really want to go through the communities to get there. And so that's why, through the Sunrise Project, I hope that we can change the environment in so many of these communities around the state that it then makes that travel to these places possible. Because sort of like what you had mentioned earlier about like um, in the places where sort of Black cultural life has been suppressed is actually where some of the most exciting things have grown. I tell people, believe it or not, but little old Coos Bay, Oregon can boast the largest Juneteenth event per capita in the state of Oregon. Per capita is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, but the title is nonetheless still true. And this year, we are doing we started Coos Bay's Juneteenth event in 2021, and we started Grants Pass's Juneteenth event in 2022. And this year we are partnering with Opal Lee's organization. Opal Lee, known as the grandmother of Juneteenth. And we are partnering with her organization as part of their National Walk of Freedom held on Juneteenth. And so Grants Pass is one of the 10 host cities for this National Walk of Freedom. And so on the press release, you see like National Walk of Freedom happening in Fort Worth, Texas, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, California, Grants Pass, Oregon. And it's like one of these names is not like the other. And so it is just so cool to see the exciting things that Black people around the state have been able to grow. And that's one of the things that I want to accomplish through the Sunrise Project is to sort of help unify the Black diaspora of Oregon so that it's not so separated between Black Portlanders and rural Black Oregonians, but that we can really sort of form a greater unity so that we can really make our presence more felt through a greater sense of collective power. And that can only really happen when we have the relationships across our geographical landscape.
Absolutely. And that definitely resonates with me in terms of when people talk about not going to certain places, because never mind, like most like more rural spots. But, just growing up in Lake Oswego, a town literally nicknamed Lake No Negro,
Mhm.
I've heard all my life. I mean, even to the present, 2026, where
Yeah.
people will say, I'm scared about going out there and I don't know what's going to happen to me.
Hmm.
And I told two truths there. On one hand, it's like it's a wealthy town. You'll probably be quite fine. Like it's not scary. And I don't like the idea of, I don't know how else to put this, just letting these weird white people scare you out of going to a place without even having to do anything. I think
Hmm.
there's something we just gotta
I
like
want to
push
go to
back
the Salt
against.
and Straw in downtown Lake Oswego. Like you should be able to.
Yeah, like you'll probably have a very, just enjoyable time. Like you'll get some looks from people. I don't want to say that that's not true. And as someone who's dealt with all the stuff in Lake Oswego and especially the police harassment, like that is also
Mhm.
real. But like you said, like in these spaces where so much of our culture is the most suppressed, you have some of the most exciting organizing happening. Like we're going down to Southern Oregon and the stuff that Base is doing, which is a group out there in Southern Oregon, started by some people who came to Oregon from Phoenix and kind of like brought just some of the stuff they were doing out there in Arizona to build community where it wasn't happening, and it just expanded. Like one of the things I love about Base is just like they have a program, Afro Scouts, where they're working with young children. They'll just like on social media, they'll post all these different activities like archery and drumming and all these different little projects where I'm just like, man, you know, like you said, like because not everyone can be in Portland, and there are some rites of passage programs. I was part of one for a little bit, but if you live in these other spaces, you should have the opportunity to experience blackness like this.
Mhm.
So the people doing that, like, it's so critical, and it also, again, like you can make great social media content out of it as well. So it's an added bonus. Like it serves.
Yeah, I tell people that being black in Oregon is like living amongst the desert. We have quote one oasis, northeast Portland, but
Mm,
the majority of black Oregonians live outside of that one oasis. And unfortunately, um, the majority of funding for quote black Oregon disproportionately goes to the Portland area, even though the majority of Black Oregonians live elsewhere. And so, through the Oregon Remembrance Project and partnering with groups like BASE, I want to, rather than just try and build up the one oasis that we have, let's try and grow smaller oases all throughout the desert. Because if you live 4 hours away from the oasis, it doesn't really do you much good if it's really out there flourishing because you are in a desert starved of blackness. I had an experience this past summer that really crystallized the sort of why we do that, and you're on the same page of. So I was out in Baker City, and it was a really long day of driving, and so I didn't feel like going to a sit down restaurant. And so I just went through the McDonald's drive through line. And there was a young black man working the window. And I was struck at how excited he was to see me. In his words, I don't see many people who look like me living out here. And so we chatted, and I was staying in town for work, and the McDonald's is just off the highway, so it meant something to him that I wasn't just passing through, but that I was staying in the community for a few nights. And I left that interaction, and that experience stuck with me because I don't want a stranger going through the McDonald's drive-through line to be that culturally significant of a touchstone in a young black man's life. And so this is why we need to grow these smaller oases because it doesn't do that young man any good that the oasis is growing in North and Northeast Portland because he's in the desert. And so, I want to be able to connect folks to each other so that we can grow these smaller oases so that folks can access Black cultural expression within their own home community.
yeah. Yeah. Again, it's crucial, and it's I think that other piece of people feeling scared to go to places is what naturally happens is the stories of the people doing the work out here get unintentionally erased
Mhm.
because people just assume, well, there's it's not safe for me there. There's no black people there. And it's like, we are here. It's a in working in these communities, I'm sure it's like the common frustration. You might hear from people who are like, I'm out here trying to reach out to people. And it's like people don't think I'm here. It's like pulling teeth because people don't believe, you know, that it's real or that it can happen. It has to be, it's almost like it has to be a trick. It's like,
Mhm.
no, actually, it's just our story as Black people in America making do out of these situations wherever we are, building place wherever we are. And yeah, there's just so much power in being able to do something like this where it's not just learning the history, it's also connecting with each other.
Mhm.
So you don't have to, like you said, you don't have to l- go to the oasis, especially if you are 4 or 5 hours away. And also, it's like, I just like the idea of saying, wherever I go in Oregon, I'd like to know there's a place I can stay. I'd like to know that there's people I can feel safe with. There's power in that beyond just any like, oh, I own this or I have this much money. Because again, growing up in a wealthy white community, I've seen how far that can take you and how far that cannot take you.
Mhm.
See, I live in a place where Blazers are known to live, and also throughout, maybe not as much in the post quote unquote jail Blazers era, but definitely when I was going to high school. And for that, where it's like you could be the child of a Blazer, that did not make you any safer, any protected.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just like it comes back to us depending on each other, having each other, building with each other, and some people, to do projects like this where it actually, you're physically taking us down to Ashland to make it happen. So it's just like it's
Yeah,
something
I'm
I really
excited.
appreciate.
And I feel like it's sort of in the same way that like Oregon feels sidestepped on the national landscape, that like it even happens to Black Oregonian, like it happens within our state too, in the same way that Oregon is sidestepped. Black rural Oregonians are sidestepped even within our own community here in the state. And so it's like if us in Black Portland want us to be more recognized nationally, we also have to recognize the Black people within our state who have these same stories that we want highlighted on a national level. And I don't think we will be able to get ourselves recognized nationally if we aren't also doing that own recognition within our state amongst our community. And that it's not just Black Portland trying to be seen on the map, but like Black Oregon seen on the map.
When you reached out, you posed this question, which I think really kind of like sums up not just where we are, but kind of like what in like our respective projects and our larger communities, the work we're really trying to do, which is over the next 50 years, why can't we make the story of Black Oregonians central to how we understand the history and evolution of race in America?
Mhm.
And I think that is like, it's not any one thing, it's not any one project. It's hopefully, doing cool stuff like this, people meeting each other, collaborating, building. But that's something I see. And it's, a lot of people are almost maybe afraid right now because, okay, there's the Trump administration attacks on anything that can be, called DEI or whatever, you know, really anything black, especially. But then you have a lot of people, whether it's foundations, sponsors, funders, who either are responding to that fear by preemptively cutting their funding, or many, let's be real, who it's the convenient excuse they have now to not center or not support this work anymore. And yet, in that potential gap, I see I see so much opportunity,
Mhm.
actually. Again, it may look different, the structures may look different, but we talked in the beginning, we talked about the civil rights movement. Was that just the power of, foundations? There's I was like celebrities and, a different style of fundraising. I think, people like Marlon Brando and people like that who helped push it. But the history is just full of examples of us, again, finding a way under, you know,
Immense obstacles. Yeah,
exactly.
I was it's funny. So I watched Trevor Noah's most recent stand-up special earlier this week, and in part of it, he was talking about. I thought it was a really good point. How we often treat history as inevitable. That oh, during World War II, oh, it was inevitable that like the Allies would win. But like there was a point during World War II where people were like, are the Nazis going to take over the world? And we often treat the civil rights movement as inevitable. That, oh, of course they were going to lead that boycott in Montgomery and they were going to be successful. And it was going to lead to all the work in Birmingham. And oh, of course they were going to be successful in Selma. But none of that was inevitable. And when thinking about, Oregon claiming a space, so doing this work with the Oregon Remembrance Project, I had to learn to stop asking the question, why me? And instead learn to start asking the question, why not me? And so similarly, like Selma was not a meaningful or remarkable place in American history until they led the march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And so we can do things contemporarily that make our communities here in Oregon remarkable and historically meaningful. And just in the same way that it was not inevitable that Montgomery becomes this birthplace of the civil rights movement, it was not inevitable that we were able to start this work in Coos Bay and spread it to other parts of Southern Oregon. But it was a group of folks who said, why not us? And so I think that here in Oregon, over these next 50 years, we need to say more of why not us? Why shouldn't Oregon be sort of one of the main characters for understanding racism in America outside of the American South? If you think about where you would, and so this is one of my other things about Sunshine Trips is eventually expanding these into larger racial justice tours around the state of Oregon. Is the racial justice tourism industry is an industry with an exponential growth rate. Civil rights trips to the American South are a multi-million dollar industry. If you were to think about where you would go for racial justice tourism outside of the American South, you would go to Washington, D.C., and maybe some parts of New York. That's it. Why shouldn't Oregon be the prime destination for racial justice tourism on the West Coast? One of the prime destinations for racial justice tourism outside of the American South, because we have the stories we were talking about earlier. We have Jacob Vanderpool, the only known person expelled from Oregon under the state's black exclusionary laws. That is a piece of information that people should want to go experience in person. There is so much of this history that is gained from in-person experiences. I had to travel all halfway across the country to learn about Alonzo Tucker and to be inspired to want to do racial justice work at home. I don't want Oregonians or other people on the West Coast to have to make that thousands-mile trip to be able to have some of those same fire igniting experiences. And I think that us in Oregon over these next 50 years can really become known as one of those Kindle making places, these places where people come to get their fire burning for racial justice that they can then bring to their own home communities.
Mm, indeed. Indeed. Taylor, thanks again for taking the time to, yeah, just talk about what does it mean for Black Oregonians and the Black Oregon story as we approach this 250th anniversary, and more importantly, what we're going to do to make Black Oregonians the rightful main characters of our story going forward. Before I let you go, can you just tell people if they want to sign up for future Sunshine trips or
Yes.
just get connected with the Oregon Remembrance Project, where can they go?
Yes, so I have to do some updating on the website. So the best way to reach me is via Facebook or Instagram. In terms of having some of our most up-to-date information, and on Facebook and Instagram, you will find the interest form for sunshine trips, and we will be going to Coos Bay at the end of August and Grants Pass at the end of or at the beginning of October. We're not going to do it on this this upcoming trip. But for the August and October trip, one thing that we're going to do that I'm really excited about is we are going to have an intentional opportunity to watch the sun go down. And thinking about doing that in the context of communities that were once sundown towns, that miraculous sky show that we see, that red in the sky, for the majority of Oregon's history, was a warning for African Americans to get out of town. And so, for the vast majority of Oregon's history, Black Oregonians have not been able to experience a sunset outside of the Portland metropolitan area because it was unsafe for them. And so we want to claim that experience. And so I'm really excited about, and, it sounds silly, but I'm really excited about our next trips and having that opportunity to watch the sun go down, because at a certain point, it will be eerie, but I feel like us being gathered together, it will also make the hair on your arm stand up, because you're like, we're doing this together and we are reclaiming this experience for us as Black Oregonians. And I hope folks will join us on those trips.
Absolutely. Taylor Stewart, founder of the Oregon Remembrance Project. Thank you again.
Thank you.